Let's go ahead and get started. We are going to continue our series on Misquoted. I have not been in any of these classes yet because I'm teaching in high school on Sunday mornings, but it's my understanding, and hopefully this is correct, but we're going to review each week a different verse or verses and talk about how is misquoted and how to properly interpret it. I think also the point is to go through the motion of figuring it out logically through context and other applications of Scripture. Just figure, it's a part of it's the process of learning and discerning. And so we'll continue that this week. The verse I'm going to talk about is Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. And it says, and I'll read it. If you guys want to go to Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, we'll be there most of the day. Judge not, that you be not judged. I think in the King James it says, judge not, lest you be judged. So let me pause. What does that mean? This is going to be highly interactive. If you just read that, how do you interpret that? Anyone? As you read it, if you just read that there, how do you read that?
You don't judge me, and I won't judge you.
Yep, exactly.
But I know that's what it means.
Right.
Or you don't tell me what to do, and I won't tell you what to do.
Right. Or maybe you're having a conversation like, hey, hold up, don't judge me. Right? And so that's often, go ahead. Well, let's come back to that because I'm going to talk about the Lord's Prayer talks about repentance, but there's a connection there. But is it okay if we come back to that? It's a really good comment though. Mary.
Don't point the finger.
Don't point the finger. I know. I'm over here pointing already. I need to stop that. Put that down. That's right. Don't point the finger. And in the world, we see this a lot. In fact, I don't know, I don't have evidence of this, but I would argue from a non-Christian, worldly quoting of the Bible, this might be one of the most quoted verses. Don't judge me, right? Which is interesting, right? So I think you can definitely see that this is a misquoted verse. But let's get into it. We're going to approach the understanding of this verse in three ways. One, we're going to leverage the teachings of Jesus and the apostles to understand what does this this verse mean. Second, we're going to explore the context surrounding this verse, and there's a lot of context, both before and after, that helps us with this. And then last, I thought it'd be good to have a discussion of examples of judging from Scripture, and just have a good discussion. So that's the plan for today. All right. So without any further ado, so what does Jesus and the apostles command as it relates to judging? And let's first turn to John chapter 7, verse 24. And Jimmy, if you could read that for us, that'd be great.
Not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteousness judgment.
Great. So this starts to give us some clues here. We also have 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 15. Rocky?
Corinthians 2, verse 15, but he that is spiritual judgeth all things, yet he himself is judged in no man.
Great. And then 1 Corinthians 5:12.
But now I write you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother if he is guilty of sexual immorality or greed, or is an adulterer, reviler, drunkard, or swindler, not even to eat with such a one. For what have I to do with judging outsiders? Is it not those inside the church whom you are to judge? God judges those outside. Purge the evil person from yourself.
Great. So as we read these three verses, we have application and a command from Jesus and the apostles to judge. So how do we reconcile this? Matthew 7:1 says, hey, do not judge, lest ye be judged. So how do we reconcile this? Is the Bible and is Jesus contradicting himself? No. So maybe there's more nuanced understanding in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. Okay, and so that's what we're going to talk about, is that nuance. So then let's read a couple more verses. James chapter 2, verse 4.
I may not show impartiality among yourselves, and become judges of evil thoughts.
Great. And let's read Romans chapter 2, verse 1.
Therefore, you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge. For in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same things.
Great. There are many other verses we could go to, but this clearly shows that there is specific guidance on judging. We are commanded to judge, but under specific guidance. I highlighted in red and blue where we're not to and when we are. So let's sum this up a little bit. You see, do not judge by appearances. Does anybody remember what the context of Jesus saying that in John chapter 7? Does anyone remember? So Jesus healed a man on the Sabbath, and the scribes and Pharisees were all up in arms. You did a work. You did something on a Sabbath. And he points out to them, hey, you guys circumcise people on the Sabbath. Why? To fulfill the law of Moses. Well, why are you upset that I'm healing somebody on the Sabbath? And so he says, do not judge by appearances, but instead judge with right judgment. Right? So this is a good contrast. The spiritual person judges all things, but is himself to be judged by no one. There, we get a little bit more guidance on the spiritual person. The next verse, we see judging, not to judge outside of the church, but to judge within the church. That's interesting. And that's in the context of sexual immorality, right? There was sexual immorality in the church, in the Corinthian church that Paul writes to. I think he spent 3 years there. So he knew these people really well. All right. So to sum that up, we clearly read that judging is commanded. There is some specific guidance. And I would argue that righteous, that Jesus talked about in John chapter 7, verse 24, righteous depicts the character and manner by which we are to judge. 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 15 clearly says the spiritual person judges. So let's talk about that for a moment. What does that mean, the spiritual person? Someone who's in tune with God's will. I like that. Right? Someone who's seeking, who understands and is seeking God's will. That's great. We're going to read some scriptures that corroborate what Keith just said. Anybody else?
Someone who is loving and compassionate and will put themselves in that position, it's not about them, it's about the restoration.
That's right. Someone who's loving and is seeking the good of the other person. And we'll also come back to that, Mary, when we review the context. It's a really good point. And in fact, the contrast of that is you're unloving, right? Maybe hypocritical. Anyone else? Good. The next thing I think is implied in these, not necessarily directly, but some other verses we'll read talk about this, but it's exercising humility in our judgment. Romans chapter 2, verse 1, I think, Mark, you read that. Doesn't that come out in here? I think it does. Romans goes on to talk about the grace of Jesus Christ, right? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, right? If we recognize we're all sinners, right? But then to Mary's point, recognize that, hey, we've been saved. There is a right and wrong. There is a right and wrong. There is a way to salvation, and that's in Jesus Christ. But then we love, and then we do judge as it relates to saving a brother. So, but the key thing is the loving and the humility there. So let me pause. Any additional thoughts or comments? Great. I might not have to deploy the Ibbetson rule today. We're moving right along. All right. Let's explore the context surrounding this verse. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 falls within what common topic? Anybody know? Sermon on the Mount. That's right. So I was told we had an elders deacons meeting to use 3.2 font. And so here it is. We're gonna read directly off this. We got Matthew 5, Matthew 6, and Matthew 7. And so here we got 3.2 font. And this is the Sermon on the Mount. So Matthew 7:1 is in the upper right. Let's read it. No, I'm just joking. All right. I think it's highly relevant that Jesus goes up on the mountain. He preaches to the multitude. He also is preaching to his disciples. And he talks about a lot of things. He starts out talking about the Beatitudes. A number of statements, I think there's 9, but check me on that. Statements of blessed are that describe people who are blessed because of certain actions and thinking. He then goes on to talk about you are the salt, you are the light, all for the glory of God. He then, interestingly, goes and talks about the law. He said, I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill the law. But right at the end of that section, he makes a specific comment that seemingly is out of place. And he says, let's read it. Everyone turn to Matthew chapter 5, verse 20. And I think this context is really important. Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, I'll read it. Again, this is in reference to Christ fulfilling the law. He says, for I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. He's really calling them out, isn't he? Let's keep that in mind. Christ then goes on to talk about lots of different topics that honestly go back to the law and go back to the 10 Commandments. But he draws contracts of what has been taught by the scribes, by the Pharisees, and what the godly approach to those topics are. He talks about anger. He talks about lust. He talks about divorce. He then goes on to talk about giving to the needy. He talks about praying. We talked about the model prayer. He also talks about how not to pray. He talks about fasting. He talks about treasures, basically priorities. Where do you put your priorities? Treasures in heaven. He talks about anxiety, right? Not to worry. He then talks about judging. And what's interesting here is he then goes on, he talks about asking God for things, making requests. He talks about the golden rule. He talks about beware of false prophets. You will recognize them by their fruits or their actions. And that has a tie to, I think, the context here of judging as well. And then, I never knew you. He talks about entering the kingdom of heaven. And by the way, sprinkled in there earlier is entering by the narrow gate. He then talks about building your house on the rock, the firm foundation, which is Jesus. So that is the context. But as you read through this, Jesus specifically draws contrast. Look, Jesus is giving a full sermon here. There's a lot of points. And we could probably take a whole quarter on this. So I'm going through this quickly, especially since it's 3.2 font. But Jesus specifically draws contrast to hypocritical actions to the godly approach to that topic. He specifically calls and draws contrast on topics for judging. And this is why I wanted to talk about the whole Sermon on the Mount. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But he also does that giving to the needy. Does anyone remember the hypocritical actions taken by some around giving? Mark?
They would basically, instead of supporting their parents, they would say this is all a gift to God and wouldn't take care of their aging parents.
Right. Well, that's a great example. That's not in the Sermon on the Mount, but that is a perfect example of hypocrisy. In this verse, I'll read it, Matthew chapter 6. He draws contrast to letting everybody know. You know, he says, let me just read it. Chapter 6, verse 1. Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you that they have their reward. But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will himself reward you openly. So there's one example of the contrast of hypocrisy. And by the way, Mark, I think the example you gave is what Jesus was probably thinking about right here. Because, you know, we said earlier that he said, hey, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. He then goes on to talk about prayer, and we know the model prayer, but he also has a compare and contrast on how not to pray. Does anybody remember the hypocritical way of praying?
Doing it on the street corner.
Yeah, doing it on the street corner. Yeah, right? And so Jesus, just like Mark said with the giving, Jesus talks about that later too. So this is a topic he keeps pointing out around hypocrisy. He then talks about fasting. We don't talk about fasting a whole lot. So I wouldn't be surprised if nobody remembers. Well, what's a hypocritical way you fast? To be seen, that's right. And how does he call it out? They mar their face. You know, right, yeah. Well, the way I would just, what I think about when I read this, because I wake up and, you know, we get, make ourselves look nice, you know. Keaton selected me because of the eye candy, right? But I imagine, like, if I was fasting, and clearly I am not fasting, but if I was fasting, what I interpret this to be is, you know, you wake up and, you know, I don't look bad enough, so you just kind of like, you mar your face. But that's what Jesus is saying. Why? So you can be applauded by man for the things you're doing. That's kind of the concept. What I'm trying to show here is there is a pattern of hypocritical actions and then the godly approach. And then you get to judging. So let's actually go to judging. Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. I'm going to read this. So, judge not that you be not judged. You can't stop there. You got to keep reading. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged, And with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. Now, I'd actually argue you can't even stop there either. He's made it clear. He's given you all you need. But just to make it crystal clear, Jesus then goes on to talk about a hyperbolic analogy. And let's read about it. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove the speck from your eye, and look, a plank is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So there's two eyes, my eye and then my brother's eye. In our brother's eye is a speck, but in my eye is what? A plank. Now, maybe the plank isn't translated, I don't know, but when I think about a plank, I think about a ship. I was a Navy guy, walk the plank. But I'm thinking of something big, something big sticking out of your eye versus a tiny little speck. When I was little, I remember, and I can't remember even what it was, but I was out at the farm. My dad was a farmer, and our dad was a farmer. But something got in my eye, and I was freaking out. My dad laid me down on the pickup and tried to help me get it out, but it was just a little speck. But it was, in my opinion, debilitating. And it was the biggest thing at the time. But you've got a big plank, and you're trying to get somebody, the speck out of your brother's eye. And so that's a very hyperbolic kind of analogy, but it gets to the point of, and he says it, single word with an exclamation point, hypocrite. But does he say, hey, just don't judge at all, though? Just walk away? No. What does he say? Say it again, Christy.
First get the plank out of your eye, and then you can help your brother.
Correct. So Christy said, first, get that big plank out of your eye. Once it's out, now you can see clearly and help your brother. So it's very interesting. In the very verse, people misquote, say, judge not. Don't judge me. If you keep reading, it then goes on to say, actually, judge your brother. But you can't do that if you're doing those same things. And in this case, you're actually more guilty than your brother. If you can compare the plank versus the speck. Yeah.
I like the ESV version that says, get the log out of your eye. The plank is a part cut off from the log.
Okay.
The log is the whole thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, even more, right? I mean, that's something that's protruding from your, you're probably dead at that point, but, yep. Any other comments on this? Mark?
Yeah, so Jesus does this a lot. I mean, the woman accused of prostitution or sexual immorality, I can't remember exactly, but there was a crowd and they were accusing her and he drew in the dust and then, he said, whoever doesn't have sin, throw the first stone. Right?
Yep.
So that's the judging part is the stoning, right?
That's right.
But it's exactly the same situation where go fix yourself before you start accusing them.
I love it. So just, I'll come back to you, Daniel, 1 second. So Mark had a really good point. And his point is Jesus uses this approach of contrasting what's not correct and what is correct. Even when he was challenged by the Pharisees, they brought an adulterous woman to him and said, basically looking for him to condemn them. And he traps them by saying, okay, whoever is without sin, cast the first stone. And this is exact, example. I'm not sure where that's at, but I think it's in, it doesn't matter. But anyway, that's a perfect example of this. In fact, Jesus also somewhat uses it in the parable of the unrepenting servant. I think it's in Matthew chapter 18. In Matthew chapter 18, there's a parable where you have the righteous king who forgives his servant of 10,000 talents, and the unforgiving servant who won't forgive his brother 100 denarii. That's another, those two things are juxtaposed together to draw contrast to hypocrisy and then God's redeeming mercy and grace. Pretty exciting. Daniel.
Yeah, as far as also thinking about the contrast between the Pharisees and what Jesus was trying to teach, he said at one point, he said, you tithe of mint and anise, cumin, and you've forgotten the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. And so a key thing as we think about judging is we've got to look back and say, what is my motive? What is my motive here in what I am judging? And the thing too is, a lot of times we're judging actions, but at the same time, we've got to have love for that person and want what's best for them. And so what our heart is toward that, what our thoughts are toward that, make sure we don't have envy or jealousy or anything that's going into that judging.
Great points. There's a lot there. And, if I summarize that, a lot of good points. It really starts with our heart and what's in our heart as we're conducting the judging, and specifically having a heart of love. Okay, great. So let's wrap this up. And let's discuss several verses, and let's make it practical for the congregation here. Sound good? All right. Could I get a volunteer to read Acts chapter 4, verse 18 through 20?
Then they called them in again and commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. But Peter and John replied, which is right in the eyes of God, to listen to you or to him, you be the judge. As for us, we cannot help speaking about what we have seen and heard.
So judging can have can imply more or less things. A lot of times we think of judging in terms of judgment. Maybe a judge would pronounce judgment, which is encompassing a few different things. It's encompassing both discerning or determining correctness or lawfulness. It's also including the pronouncement or bringing to an account for that transgression. Here, it's not so much pronouncing judgment as in a judge would sentence, maybe a better word is sentencing, but here we see judging being defined effectively as determining correctness. And so what is Peter saying as it relates to determining correctness in what Keith just read?
Knowing God's will.
Knowing God's will, right? They're telling Peter and John, after being beaten, to stop preaching Jesus. Going back to what Daniel said, they judged in their hearts lovingly and recognized that, hey, only way themselves and others will be saved is by preaching Jesus Christ. And so part of judging, first and foremost, is judging our path to salvation. It's the first step. So let's do another practical discussion. Could I get a volunteer to read 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 27 to 31?
Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of concerning the body and the blood of the Lord. Let a person examine himself then, and so eat the bread and drink the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without discerning the body eats and drinks judgment on himself, That is why many of you are weak and ill, and some have died. But if we judge ourselves truly, we would not be judged.
Isn't that interesting? We read that all the time before we take the Lord's Supper. What does that mean, that what Todd just read? You have to judge yourself. That's exactly right. We are to judge ourselves. We need to continually, not just before we take the Lord's Supper, yes, while we take the Lord's Supper, but we need to continually be looking at our own actions, our own thoughts, and discerning or determining correctness. And so a big part of judging is judging ourselves. And by the way, if we do that, we're less likely to be hypocritical. Go ahead.
Yeah, to add on to some of the previous comments, when you look at judging, I mean, there's all kinds of things we have to make decisions about. We evaluate things that we see, we evaluate actions, we evaluate things we've been taught, and we're supposed to evaluate them against truth. Yes. And we make a judgment on that basis. So I think when you see what Jesus is condemning and what he's approving, it's the type of judgment where it's superficial, where you don't weigh out all the facts and you make a decision based on your biases. It's judgments that you make where you're trying to divert attention away from yourself toward other people. So it's a hateful judgment, which is what Jesus is specifically talking about in Matthew chapter 7, where you're pointing out all the faults in other people to make them look bad, without ever thinking about how bad you really are. So that's a hypocritical, mean-spirited type of judgment. The type of judgments Jesus wants us to make are judgments that are truthful, that are righteous, that are based on what the truth is, and it's based on trying to help people to change. We shouldn't, I know you haven't talked about this yet, and I don't know if you will, but we shouldn't infer that Matthew 7 is saying we have to be sinless in order to be able to make judgments, because he's not saying that either, because there are no sinless people. But what it's talking about is the attitude of the heart in making those judgments, and those we have to be very, very careful about. And we see unrighteous judgments made all the time. Just watch TV. Just watch all the garbage that's coming in over your laptop and computer and iPad. There's all kinds of things where people are making judgments about things where they're trying to influence your opinion, bad or good, towards somebody, and they haven't gathered all the facts together. And we can get caught up into that kind of stuff if we're not careful. That's the type of judgments that God is condemning, because those are judgments aimed at trying to hurt people, not trying to change people for the better. And that the judgments God wants us to make is where we're trying to help people get better, help ourselves get better.
The really great comments, Rocky, and again, you made several really good comments. I probably won't get them all, but I think there was a point there, just to synthesize a little bit, was there is a standard. There is a standard by which we are to judge. And it's a really good point of that standard is the truth. And Jesus is the truth. And by the way, that standard helps us to determine correctness. It allows us to have righteous judgment. I think the second thing Rocky brought out, which is another really good point, is what is our attitude? What Jesus is sharing in Matthew chapter 7, verse 1, is a mean-hearted type of attitude. Versus in contrast to, what Daniel had mentioned and a few others, having in Mary, having an attitude of love. What is in the best interest of that person relative to that standard, not just of correctness, but that standard of salvation? Right? And a third point he brought up, which, I was going to talk about later, but I'll talk about it now. And that is this comment, okay, and by the way, this is another... It's actually a false logic. It's a fallacy. But this notion of, hey, you can't judge unless you are perfect or you are sinless. Well, that is fallacious, first off. But second, it's illogical, because is anyone sinless? No. Who wrote 1 Corinthians? We were in the 1 Corinthians earlier. Paul, okay. So was Paul sinless? He called himself the chief of sinners. But was he still against that standard that Rocky's talking about? Was he still determining correctness? He was, right? So a lot of people will say, hey, going back to what Jesus said, hey, you cast the first stone, you who are sinless. Nobody's sinless, so they couldn't cast a stone. But that does not mean that there isn't a standard and there isn't a right and wrong. Go ahead.
Well, if you mentioned 1 Corinthians 5 earlier, but if you go further into 1 Corinthians 6, the first few verses, he says, the saints will judge the world.
Yes.
He says, you will judge angels. So at some point, we have to, and basically the context is, don't take your brother to law. Why are you using outsiders for judgment? You need to be handling these matters internally. But to that point, he says, you need to get used to this because you're not perfect, but you're going to be asked to judge others based on the standard that we've been given.
That's a really good point. And I'll get to you next, Keaton. I think the point Mark made was so good, it's worth us reading. So he quoted from 1 Corinthians chapter 6. I think it's verse 1 through 3. But I'll read that for everybody here. But dare any of you, having a matter against another, go to law before the unrighteous? I mean, doesn't this just synthesize everything we've just talked about? And not before the saints? And not before the saints? Do you not know that the saints will judge the world? And if the world will be judged by you, are you unworthy to judge the smallest of matters? Do you not know that we shall judge angels? How much more things that pertain to this life? If then you have judgments concerning these things pertaining to this life, do you appoint those who are least esteemed by the church to judge? I say this to your shame. And I think it's a really good kind of summation. But just for speed here, Keaton, you had another comment.
You mentioned Paul, and I think he's a great example. We look at, how did Paul do it versus how sometimes we get it wrong with regards to interfacing with other people. I think Paul had an acute understanding, and he points to it in all of his writings, that he's not the one that's going to send anybody to heaven or hell.
Yeah.
And I think that's an important distinction. I think we sometimes get it wrong as, we want to highlight where everybody else is wrong. I think that's where this verse gets kind of a bad rap because people do that. But Paul is pointing out, again, to your point, he's using the standard, but he's always circling back to this is because this is the will of God, this is the plan of God, Christ came to die for this plan, that God is a righteous judge that will judge one day, and our job is just to adhere as close to that as possible. We think of judging, and you use the judge that has, the ability to issue sentencing. That's not our power or responsibility. So we think of the phrase judge, and it's kind of semantics, but we think of judging, and we think we've got the full power to do what a judge today does, which is hear, assess, and provide sentencing. But that's not the case. We may look at this and say we have the ability to assess based on a standard, but the sentencing isn't our job. And I think that's where Paul gets it so right, and that's where he is aware, I'm the worst sinner. I don't have any ability to judge, but I do have the ability to assess based on a standard. And, again, that's subtle nuance, but that may change the whole way we interact with people and certainly use this verse in its correct context.
Yeah, that's fantastic, Keaton. Appreciate it. So let me just synthesize for everybody. So Keaton had, again, several points that were really good. One of those points is he says, hey, look at Paul's example more fully. And what he does is he leverages the standard, has the right attitude for the person or the congregation's benefit, but he doesn't do something else, which is draw sentence. Then he references effectively a verse where God is the only judge. And I think that verse is in James chapter 4, verse 2. Let's go there real quick because it's such a good point. His point is that Paul doesn't draw the sentence. He recognizes that God will do that. He just points it out for the saving of the soul. And that's the way we are to. We're not the sentencing party. That is God. But we are to discern correctness and save a brother from sin. I think it's in James chapter 4, verse 2, where he was talking. Let's go there real quick. I know I can find it. I know it's in James. Maybe if somebody else finds it first, you could read it. But it's just a fantastic point about who is the ultimate judge as it relates to sentencing. 4:12. Okay, great. I knew it was in chapter 4. So do not speak evil of one another, brethren. He who speaks evil of brother and judges his brother speaks evil of the law and judges the law. Well, isn't that interesting? Continuing on. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer of the law, but a judge. This is what Keaton's talking about. Keep going. There is one lawgiver who is able to save and destroy. Who are you to judge another? That one is God. And so that's Keaton's point, and it's a really good point. Hey, how much time do we got left? 2 minutes? All right. If it's okay, there's a couple more here that are really good. I'm sorry. Can I get a volunteer? Mary, could you read 1 Corinthians 5:12?
That's because I raised my hand, right?
Yeah, that's right. I'm sorry.
Okay, 1 Corinthians 5:12. For what have I to do with judging those who are outside? Do you not judge those who are inside? But those who are outside, God judges. Therefore, put away from yourselves the evil person.
Very good. So the point here is church discipline. We are absolutely instructed to have church discipline and to judge those inside the church. There's many examples of this. If you go to Revelation chapter 2 and chapter 3, there's multiple examples of that. I can't remember. I think it's the church of Thyatira, but I might get this wrong. He says, hey, you're doing all these great things, but I have this against you. You tolerate that woman Jezebel, who leads my children astray, basically. I'm paraphrasing. So church discipline is a good piece of it. One more. Could I get somebody to read James chapter 5, verse 19 and 20?
My brothers, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone brings him back, let him know that whoever brings back a sinner from his wandering will save his soul from death and will cover a multitude of sins.
Great. And what does that mean? It means we are to discern what is correct relative to our standard, not pass sentence, but go and save our brother from sin. Because if we do, we're going to save their soul. And this is the whole point. This is where we started. We end with, what is the overall goal? It's salvation in Jesus Christ. And so judging is an obligation. Let's use that word. Judging is an obligation of Christians, but it's to be done with righteous judgment in the manner and conduct by which we do it. It's to be done spiritually with God's will in mind, which is a standard that we know right here. God is the lawgiver. And it's to be done in humility and love, recognizing that we too are sinners and that Christ is the way to salvation. So we bring them to them. So that's it. Thank you so much. Next week, we're going to have a lesson in John 14. And Robert Holland will be leading that. So thank you, everyone.